being Senior Vice President and Brzezinski Chair in Global Security and Geostrategy here at CSIS. I'm delighted to welcome you to this very important program on the crisis in Lebanon. CSIS is especially grateful to USAID, which has provided support to CSIS for this event. We're here to discuss what seems to be an increasingly complex situation in Lebanon, a situation which continues to shock us with the speed and the scale of the country's downfall. Lebanon has generally been considered a middle-income country known for its well-educated and cosmopolitan population. But earlier this month, the UN's Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights concluded after a visit that Lebanon is a rapidly failing state. He warned that unless swift and decisive measures are taken, its downward spiral will accelerate. Lebanon's crisis has clear economic and political components, and its failure has profound implications not only for the growing number of Lebanese who have fallen into poverty, but also communities of perhaps 1 million Syrian refugees, more than 200,000 Palestinian refugees, 200,000 foreign workers, and others at the bottom of the social scale. This event seeks to provide a better understanding of the current humanitarian conditions in Lebanon in light of the country's downward spiral, an effort to examine what is unique about this crisis, an effort to identify opportunities for external actors to improve conditions for the most vulnerable, and to think about what external actors should do and shouldn't do. I really couldn't be more excited about the lineup of speakers we've assembled today. George Katana has been the Secretary General of the Lebanese Red Cross since 2013. He's served in the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement for more than 23 years and has extensive experience in all aspects of its work. He previously built up Lebanon's renowned emergency medical services network and managed the Red Cross's emergency relief operations. Sally Abi-Khalil is Oxfam International's MENA director. She's a humanitarian and development practitioner with more than 20 years' experience across the MENA region. She was previously Oxfam's country director for Lebanon, making her the first Lebanese woman to lead an INGO response to the Syria crisis. Haneen Sayed is the World Bank's lead specialist working on social protection and jobs in the Middle East. She's worked at the World Bank for nearly 3 decades and led the World Bank's coordination of the Syria crisis response from 2011 to 2017. Since the onset of the crisis in Lebanon, she's been leading the World Bank's social response, including a large-scale emergency social safety net program. Dr. Maha Yahya is director of the Malcolm Kerr Carnegie Middle East Center in Beirut. Her work focuses on political violence and pluralism, development, and social justice, the challenges of citizenship, and the political and socioeconomic implications of the migration and refugee crisis. We're putting this group into the capable hands of my colleague Will Todman to moderate the discussion. Will has been working with me as a fellow in the Middle East program at CSIS for 5 years, and his research focuses on humanitarian issues, displacement, and conflict in the Middle East with an emphasis on Levant. He's conducted field research in 7 countries across the Middle East and North Africa, and his analysis has been published in peer-reviewed journals by think tanks and humanitarian organizations. It is a very important topic. We have an incredible panel of people to discuss it, and I'm very much looking forward to your engagement and your questions. So Will, over to you.
Thank you so much, John. As John said, we really want to explore today what external actors can do to try and improve the situation in Lebanon. And I'm absolutely delighted to have these 4 incredible guests today. The structure of the event is going to go a bit like this. We're going to start with opening remarks from each of our speakers. Then I'll ask them some follow-up questions. But at the end, I'm going to open things up to the audience. So if you have questions that you would like to submit, please do so on the CSIS website. So if you go to www.csis.org, then click on events, you'll see this event there, and you can see a button to submit your questions. So I wanted to start with you, Mr. Katani, if possible. And The winter is coming in Lebanon. It seems humanitarian conditions are only going to get worse in the months ahead. And I wanted to ask you, what do you view as the current humanitarian priorities in Lebanon? And how is your organization, the Lebanese Red Cross, shifting its response to address these issues?
Thank you, Mr. Todman. Dear Mr. Alterman, distinguished audience, allow me first of all to thank you, to thank the Center for Strategic and International Studies for this great initiative to invite this broad audience to raise interest in the current humanitarian situation in Lebanon. I will start by briefing about the Lebanese Red Cross in the country and then the challenges, as you mentioned. As you know, the Lebanese Red Cross started in 1945 in Lebanon. I will not talk too much about the LRC. We are leading in the country in ambulance service in the country and in the blood bank. And this is why we are responding to more than 80% on emergency medical services and more than 30% in blood for all the hospitals. All these missions are for free. And also are supporting, as you said, and according to the needs of the DM sectors regarding EcoSec relief, cash, wash, shelters, health cares, and primary health cares, and also for the youth sectors. And this is something can help you also to continue in the social support in disaster risk reduction programs, awareness, and restoring family links and migrants, and also management of dead bodies. So the Lebanese Red Cross prepare a plan of action after the experience regarding the situation in the country since 2019 October, from the forest fires to the manifestations, the COVID blast and socio-economic situation, where we start responding and helping, especially in COVID. The COVID is something where we start to transfer. Until now, we are continuing to transfer the suspected and confirmed cases, and we continue to help the people. There's a lot of need in the country and health sector. There's two main problems, the health and the relief, where the people really, they are in need according to the situation in the country and according to the big problems where you can face it. And everybody will know that there's a lack of medication, a lot of problems regarding the health sectors, regarding the chronic medicines, and regarding other sectors. And this is why the Lebanese Red Cross continue to maintain with the movement of Red Cross directors and in helping the community with a lot of program with EU, with Madad, and now we are working with the World Bank and another program for the vaccine and other programs to see how we can manage to maintain in helping and supporting the community. The advantage of the Lebanese Red Cross that we are in all the territory, we are accepted by the community, and our mission is for free. Neutral, independent, impartial, to get safer access and to have access from the north to the south, to the Bekaa, to Mount Lebanon and others. So the big challenge, how we can continue to respond to the community in COVID, in health, in accident and heart attack and other situation, also in chronic medicines. You cannot find some medicines. Our friends can present you also the big problem, the big challenge regarding the medicines, regarding the health sectors, regarding also the food and others. So this is a big tragedy where we are trying our best to see how we can help in maintaining and preserving the dignity of the community and saving lives. This is a big challenge of the Lebanese Red Cross. Also, we cannot forget the Syria crisis, where we have a lot of Syrian refugees, where we are trying to help them with the Palestinians in parallel. As Red Cross, we need to help everybody according to the fundamental principles, maintaining this response, maintaining this help, and through the challenge with the sectors, because the health sectors, they are finding the private hospital, the majority of the hospitals in Lebanon are private and more than public hospitals, where you find that there's a big challenge to receive COVID cases or other cases, because 30 to 40%, I'll not talk about 50% of the medical staff, physicians, nurses, and they left the country. So this is a big challenge. The other things is the equipment, the material, the running cost, and the people, they have to pay, and they have to help, and they have to support each other to continue being accepted in the country. So the Red Cross will focus on on what I mentioned as areas, especially in the health and relief. The cash is something very important. As you know, we respond to more than 11,000 families, $300 per month, 7 months, 2,100 to 11,000 families, and we are continuing to assess, to have a clear assessment to see the needs of the community, because there's a lot of change, there's a lot of people who have a lack of resource. There's a lack of kids' meals, there's a basic needs, there's others. I cannot talk on behalf of the others, but I can assure you there's the high unemployment rate, immigration, electricity cut, and others. Everybody know about that. So the Red Cross are in alert since 2019, trying to respond to this crisis, try to help anyone who needs us according to the needs and according to our capacity. This is, in fact, the challenge of the Lebanese Red Cross, how we can maintain and sustain the programs for a long term. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And well, there's a lot there to follow up on later. But if I can next turn to you, Sally Abi Khalil. You, as regional director, are responsible for managing Oxfam's response to some of the world's worst humanitarian crises, from Syria to Yemen. And in many ways, I suppose that the crisis in Lebanon looks quite different. We haven't yet seen really widespread displacement, violence. There isn't really widespread hunger or famine, at least yet. And I wonder if you could touch on what you think is unique about the crisis in Lebanon and what that means in terms of your response and sort of priorities that Oxfam have.
Thank you, Will. It's a privilege to be on this panel with my colleagues here today. So I really appreciate the opportunity. So indeed, the Lebanon crisis is cannot be compared to the humanitarian situation in Syria or Yemen, as you had suggested. I think what makes this crisis unique in its nature, it's that it's not really caused by a single moment or event, but a series of crises and events that have compounded the situation to deteriorate over time and really impact all communities across Lebanon. Of course, Lebanese communities, but we also have Syrian refugees and Palestinian refugees, migrant workers, and other communities that are often forgotten, like LGBTQ communities in the country. So, I think the main crises that really focused Lebanon on the international arena was definitely the Syrian refugee response, in response to the Syria crisis, where Lebanon opens its doors and has been hosting over 1 million Syrian refugees in the country, which led to a wide-scale international humanitarian response under the Lebanon Crisis Response Plan. Then this was followed by an economic financial collapse. Then this was followed by the COVID pandemic. Then this was followed by the Beirut blast, in addition to many little small crises here and there in between all of them. And this is where we are here today. And really, what is most unique about the Lebanon crises is that outside of the Syrian refugee crisis and response itself, the crises that followed are really a manifestation of a government that refuses to take the necessary steps to protect its own citizens and other communities that are on its territory, and take necessary decisions to address the multiplicity of crises. So it's about political will, or the lack of political will, that is in the country, that is impacting the most vulnerable in the country. So just to highlight some of these vulnerabilities that are really present in the country at the moment, and my colleague George definitely touched upon some of them. we have extremely elevated poverty figures. The most sort of recent vulnerability assessment that UNHCR does for Syrian refugees cites that there's been that we have nearly half of Syrian refugee households that are currently moderately or severely food insecure. So this is 1.7 times the level of 2019. We also have vulnerable Lebanese families that are struggling to cope. We have over 50% households that are considered poor, according to World Bank data. And there's a UN ESQA study on multidimensional poverty data that cites higher figures as well. 79% of Palestinian refugees, both Palestinian refugees in Lebanon and Palestinian refugees from Syria, are poor or extremely poor and have incurred new debt in the last 3 months. And we're seeing a rise in intercommunal and intracommunal tensions as well. So this past August, new data from Perception survey that monitors social stability and social cohesion indicates that about 36% of respondents are reporting negative intercommunal relations between Syrian refugees and Lebanese host communities. This is compared to 21% in 2018. We are seeing high levels of insecurity and violence that are being reported, and this is increasing over time. Looking specifically at women and girls, they continue to be disproportionately affected by gender-based violence in Lebanon. 97% of survivors are reporting an incident to the GBV information management systems are female. And the most common type of incident that is being reported is intimate partner violence, and it's quite high. And we're seeing, an exacerbation of family tensions because of the dire economic situation and the reduction in purchasing power of families that is really causing extreme stress. We see child labor is on the rise. There's been an increase among Syrian refugees from 4% to 5.3%, but we're also seeing this trend of increase across Lebanese and Palestinian families as well. And we have Syrian refugees holding valid legal residency has also decreased from 20% of over 15-year-old in 2020 holding legal residency to 16%, so that we are seeing a decrease. And our own gender analysis as Oxfam in Lebanon is also seeing a deprioritization in women's hygiene needs as well, related to menstrual health management. And this is also increasing the vulnerability and adding the stress on women in particular, both for Lebanese families and Syrian women. So again, while this, as I said to start with, the data is really telling. It's really concerning. We're seeing a downward spiral. However, but there still continues to be a lack of data, in particular for Lebanese, which I'm sure Haneen will talk about specifically. Again, this is result of lack of political will, lack of decision making by a government that is really hampering the situation. Yet, nonetheless, we have a responsibility to respond. We have a responsibility to continue to address vulnerabilities in Lebanon across all communities, to Syrian refugees so that they are not forgotten, and to continue to look at Lebanon as sort of part of the global goods that offering, and as well to address the vulnerabilities that continue to increase and be imposed among Syrian refugees with what we call programming in the NGO sector across the triple nexus. So from a humanitarian developmental lens, but also from a peace building or social stability lens, if you like. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sally. And And actually, my colleague Natasha Hall wrote a policy brief about this time last year, which focused on how to help marginalized groups in Lebanon. And that focused on Syrian refugees, Palestinians, and migrant domestic workers. And I think, sadly, the findings are still certainly relevant a year on. So I would encourage people to find that. Haneen, if I can turn to you, you've spearheaded the World Bank's Emergency Social Safety Net program, which includes planned cash transfers to vulnerable households. I wonder if you could tell us a bit about how donors are trying to advance social protection initiatives in Lebanon, and also how they're trying to encourage reforms at the same time.
Thank you very much, Will. And first, let me extend my thanks to the CSIS for this kind invitation. It's always a pleasure to be back with you. So thank you very much for this opportunity. I mean, I think Sally and Mr. Katana described very well the dire humanitarian and developmental situation actually in the country, and I won't go into that. I think when we get straight maybe to your second part of your question, which is about how should donors respond, or what should donors do or not do. I think we have to keep our eye on the ball of reform. Lebanon cannot get out of where it is without reform. Humanitarian support is critical, it's needed, and I'll say a little bit more about that and how and so on. But without doing the fundamental reforms, addressing the fundamental dysfunctionalities in sector after sector, if you will, it will be hard to see how Lebanon can get out of this. So now the task is daunting because almost every sector needs significant reform. And doing reform requires consensus, requires capacity, actually, of government and other stakeholders to do it. So where does Lebanon start? I think the best way to focus that start is through working through a program with the IMF and everything that requires. At least it focuses policymakers and society's attention on the absolute key elements to get Lebanon out of its hole. And these are not, these are known things, whether it be restructuring of the banking sector, something has to be done to address and figure out who's going to take the losses and so on. There's the electricity sector, which is fundamental, and now we're seeing even more so. The more neglect there is for the reform of the electricity sector, the less Lebanon's able, and the Lebanese people are able to cope, and brings on an additional dimension to the humanitarian crises. We have public services. I mean, all of public services essentially have come to a halt. Government services in education, in health, transport, everything is very stretched. You go to a ministry today, as you know, staff come normally just one day a week on Wednesdays for a few hours and so on. And that's partly, of course, because the crisis has brought on a serious deterioration of their purchasing power, so they're almost paid nothing. And then on top of that, the fuel crises over the summer. Initially, it was no fuel, and now fuel, but at very high prices and so on. But fundamentally, to address this issue requires looking at public sector administration and working out an agreement to how to reinvigorate public sector. Again, that would be part of, for example, I'm not predicting what an IMF program would have in it, but I'm saying that these are very fundamental issues which require consensus, but which Lebanon has to address. And the donor community is stressing that, as you know, whether it be the international community, international organizations such as World Bank and others. This is a regular we urge the government at every occasion. This morning there was at the Sarai with the Prime Minister chairing the 3RF consultative group headed by EU and UN and World Bank. And again, urging the government to address the key reforms, to come to a program with the IMF and the like. So I think this is something that we have to keep sort of at. In parallel, we have to address people's humanitarian needs. I mean, Sally described it really well. It's very severe, and it's not getting any better. There's just no way it will get better without the bigger picture coming in. We can put money into it, and we are, and we should. But there's also going to be, as we know, international community's attention. If another crisis breaks out somewhere else, it will move there. So Lebanon really needs to start taking opportunity of the funds that are coming now, which could be much more if Lebanon implemented some of these reforms. But what is coming into, for example, the sector of social protection, which I work deeply in, and it is consisting of a lot of programs or significant programs to help people survive through cash transfers. And even Lebanese Red Cross, Mr. Katani mentioned that. This is a new area for the Lebanese Red Cross, but they have also seen how effective this can be. So the Emergency Social Safety Net program that the World Bank is providing the government $246 million to implement is a major cash transfer program for the extreme poor. But it also, and this is also something very important, is trying to preserve human capital through making sure that children at risk do not drop out of school. Because all of these things that we talked about, the humanitarian, what I worry about is their long-term impact on human capital, on people's mental health. I mean, things that really you can't reverse if you let them go on for too long. So the program, any program, must also look not just providing families cash, but also how to help them in a more developmental way. I think the donor community is quite in agreement in terms of the importance of social protection, and it's the focus. There are many areas of social protection, and ultimately we want to see a much more universal approach. But Lebanon, with its current fiscal situation, and it probably cannot be providing overnight universal health and so on, but it should start in that direction. So donor community, we are supporting the government with looking at a more comprehensive approach, but then what are the really urgent needs? Cash transfer to poor families are very urgently needed. Now Lebanon's already has been feeling the impact of removing the subsidies on fuel, the foreign exchange subsidy. Fuel prices, of course, have gone up now to very high levels. And inflation is also similarly reacting. So, and people's purchasing power continues to deteriorate. So, providing a compensation package for Lebanese and as well as non-Lebanese population is going to be important in the coming year. Now, this has already been discussed. It was already planned more than a year ago. And yet it hasn't yet happened. It hasn't yet been launched. And everybody's asking why the government hasn't yet started with the broad coverage cash transfer program to help people mitigate the impact of fuel subsidy removal. And this brings us back to really the fundamental blockages of government, of governing that take place. It's not just the government, it's also the parliament, it's the political actors and how they all interact, where decision-making in Lebanon just gets blocked. For whatever reasons, it's too complicated to get into. But so very quickly to summarize in terms of, I think donors have to keep the ball on the reform, keep talking about that, keep pushing the government on that. In parallel, help government with putting back in place or functioning public services like education, health, and so on, helping families with meeting basic needs through cash transfer and other humanitarian programs. And one last topic, which I can say more about later, is about building the systems. I mean, you need to build systems to be able to implement all these programs. This might give some avenue or some hope to being able to get out of this crisis. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I definitely want to ask you more about the systems that we can be building a bit later on. But I think we've heard from George Katani, we've heard from Sally Abi Khalil about the humanitarian needs and the scale of them. I think we've also heard from Haneen that really the only solution is reforms ultimately, and until there are serious reforms made by the government, none of these issues are going to be truly addressed. And so, Dr. Yahya, if I turn to you, I'm afraid I've given you the really difficult question here, which is, can external actors catalyze a different type of politics in Lebanon? Can they exert pressure to really induce the scale of reforms that are needed? And if you can touch on sort of how the challenges of the political system really play out when thinking about aid and humanitarian aid. How can we ensure that aid doesn't just further these networks of patronage, which the political elite have relied on for decades? So thank you.
Thank you, Will. And again, I want to add my voice to my co-panelists for inviting me to be part of this very timely, I think, discussion with George, Sally, and Haneen, and yourself, of course. The tough question. Look, for external actors, I think they're already doing a very important job at pushing for reforms, which Haneen has just spoken about. What has been interesting is the kind of the extent to which they really are speaking with one voice, and I'm speaking obviously here about the EU and other Western donors. The idea that we will not, this is not something we're not willing to provide. We can provide a lot more funding to help Lebanon in the midst of its crisis, but we will not provide it unconditionally, particularly when it comes to development aid. And without this, there needs to be systematic reforms across the board. Just doing what was done before, where you promise that there will be reforms, and this has happened systematically over the past few decades, and then we kind of leave it till later, this simply will not fly anymore. Some of the reforms that are already being asked, I think, are quite manageable. I agree with Haneen that the task is daunting, particularly in a context that both George and Sally, I think, have captured how painful it is, and how how painful and how horrific, actually. This is a country that is literally experiencing whiplash. If we just remember that in October 2019, Lebanon was considered a middle income country. Now we're talking about more than 60% poverty rates. And I mean, you heard the rest. So the idea that the kind of reforms that are needed need to be paced. They're overwhelming in the sense of how much needs to be done, but I think they can be paced in a way that makes it achievable. One thing is that external actors, and I need to say this, in trying to catalyze a different politics, they definitely should not get involved in the upcoming elections, since we're talking about the political context. Adopting any candidate or any list is a kiss of death. And it's not something they should be. This is a homegrown effort, and it needs to be done as a homegrown effort. And I can talk a bit more about this if there's interest. The system in Lebanon, if we want to talk a bit about the politics of aid, the system in Lebanon, as Haneen described, is completely deadlocked. To my mind, it's one that can only produce crisis rather than find solutions. Basically, frankly, the collapse of state institutions and of society doesn't seem to be impacting the ruling cartel until now. We're looking at, for me, if I were to describe it, I'd say there's criminal neglect of both the country and its people, and of the refugees residing in it. The Lebanese state is not fulfilling its duty either to protect or to provide for its citizens. The cash transfer program that Haneen just mentioned has been ready for more than 2 years, and yet it's stuck in the midst of political bickering between parties. One part of the tug of war is over which database to use and where the data should be housed. And this is really, the issue here is not the data, but rather they still are looking at ways to extract rent from the state in any shape or form possible. The data here provides an opportunity to service their own clients, to expand patronage networks, particularly in a context where, again, the socioeconomic situation is so dire and people desperately need help. This gives a sense of the extent to which there is a kind of almost a divorce. I mean, whatever happens to people almost doesn't seem to impact the calculus of the country's political leadership. The higher level of insecurity, my concern is as we move forward, the higher levels of insecurity that Sally mentioned are going to be amplified. We're already seeing a lot more incidents, particularly in peripheral areas, but also in the cities. The race to the bottom between, the Lebanon's poor and refugees is very much there. So in this broader context, I think humanitarian support has the coordinated effort, but it should not be conditioned. And I think this is where I would like to emphasize in terms of what donors can do. There's a desperate need for humanitarian support, and that support needs to continue coming in, both to NGOs, and there are plenty of very credible NGOs, but I would not completely discount all state institutions. We don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. There are functioning institutions. I look at, for example, there's a desperate need for support in the education sector, and Hanin was the lead on much of that, so she can talk a bit more about this. But there is a desperate need. Today, the education system in Lebanon is buckling under the pressure it's facing. The transfer, the number of students that have moved from the private system schools to public schools has increased tremendously. They were talking about 18 to 20% at a time when the schools are already doing double shifts, morning for Lebanese students and afternoons for refugees. Teachers are suffering, they can't make it to schools, etc. We won't go into the details. So there needs to be a real support to that sector, for example, and the health sector is another one, because if we lose those, we lose the medium to long-term impact on Lebanon are huge. And frankly, this is a real transformation of a country, a fundamental transformation in the very identity of a country that has always prided itself on its human resources, on the high education of its people. Another issue, and this will be kind of my final thing, my final comment for now. Another issue is timeframes and exit strategies. There is a genuine concern that Lebanon becomes a society in time that is like a broader refugee community in Lebanon or elsewhere that is totally dependent on aid. Because of the lack of a political vision of how to get out of this, no political consensus. I agree with Hanin. The IMF, even if there's the best reform plan that is carved by the team with the IMF, until now, I don't see any political consensus on moving forward with that kind of a deal. The same with exit strategies, and I think this is where donors need to continue to insist. Humanitarian aid should not be conditioned on this, but they need to continue insisting on seeing exit strategies. Okay, we will provide aid for you, humanitarian support, let's say for 5 years, but after 5 years, what are you going to do? What are the exit strategies so that we don't end up with a society that is totally reliant on international support? Because that international support will not stay. There will be other crises, and actually Lebanon is in a region that is rife with crises and ongoing wars. There are at least 4 active conflicts in the region at this particular moment. Coup d'etats. The developmental impact of the last decade has been huge in terms of rollback on development gains, whether in health and education and in a broad range of issues. Just look at Syria. Other than the refugees, we're looking at 6.7 million internally displaced. So I think this is something to keep in mind as donors engage with Lebanese politicians and the political leadership of the country. I'll stop right here.
Thank you so much. I certainly want to get into the sort of mid and longer term impacts later on of these crises, but I suppose Firstly, I want to turn back to the more immediate future and to take a scenario in which, unfortunately, this current trajectory continues, this downward spiral continues, and conditions continue to get worse for the most vulnerable. The political class doesn't really feel the effects of that and doesn't implement these reforms. In the sort of near to midterm, Mr. Katani, if I can turn to you, how does the Lebanese Red Cross shift what it's doing to respond to even more humanitarian need? And how do the social and political obstacles that we've been talking about shape and limit your response? I think you're muted, sir. Thank you.
I'm sorry. Thank you very much. Well, we took these lessons learned from the manifestation, COVID, blast, where the blast worked a lot. It was a mess, a tragedy for us, for the hospitals, for the health, when you evacuate more than 3,000 in 24 hours and deliver 1,500 blood units and 11,000 families help in cash transfer program. And the others, primary health and others, it take you, the socioeconomic, take you to have these lessons learned and to revise your strategy in a way that you shift. Our strategy was in 2018 is something for 5 years, and now is something else. We are living always in crisis and in alerts, and this is why we start to think about the operational priorities of the strategy of the Lebanese Red Cross in Lebanon, from the ensure that victims of accidents, illness, and major incidents receive a prompt and effective hospital emergency care. Then it provides safe blood products for patients in Lebanon. As you know, they don't have safe, the reactive, they don't have the ambulance, they don't have the equipment and others. So, and the third one is the improve access of the population to the quality primary health care services, which means three main operational priorities of 5. And the fourth one is the basic needs, EcoSec, wash, and cash, where we need to respond to the vulnerable people affected by crisis and emergencies. And number 5, reduce the impact of disaster on the population, because you know the local community are the first responders. We are the second responders. And this is why we are awareing and training the governorates, the municipality, the local community, the public, and the private sectors to be aware. This is the advantage of the Lebanese Red Cross. We are very strong enough to be accepted by the community, to get safe access, and to have all these contacts with all the parties in the field. And after the experience with Syria crisis since 2012, you know, we are responding in parallel to Syria crisis. We cannot stop helping them. The second one is the national society development. We need to develop our the 10 national society development objectives, from the youth engagement, from financial transparency, where we need to continue due diligence, volunteering, and peer support, supply chain and logistic, where we need to have a strong system in logistic and customs and others. The branch development, you have your branches in all the territory, and they're facing a big challenge because they are decentralized. The information management and digitalizations, the disaster preparedness, the integrated programming and restoring family links, psychosocial support, response and preparedness, mitigations, and the livelihood and schools and others, as our friends mentioned, and the training and development. Always we have to continue to do this training and development. And the cross-cutting teams is something very important for, and this strategy is the protection of gender and inclusion, the community engagement and accountability, and the social environment impact. And this is why we have to respond to any crisis. We have to prepare, because we are revising. If we didn't have our contingency plan, our contingency scope to respond. And this is why we have the experience of Ebola 2014. This is why we respond to the COVID without problem, with PPEs, equipment, all this kind of work. We didn't face this challenge to lose equipment or to lose material or reactive, because in Lebanon, we are always living in crisis. It's not new for us. All the friends, they know that. Till there's no peace conventions in the Middle East, we are living in crisis. And this is why we need to prepare ourselves and to be ready in human resource and logistic and other services, how we can continue. So the challenge, how we can maintain this service, how we can help the community. As Haneen mentioned, we start the cash transfer program with the Syrian before. We increase it during the blast, and now we have to continue because there's a mass of needs of this community in poverty and other problems. So the health is a big challenge to accept. If we face the same problem like end of 2020 regarding the COVID, we will face a big tragedy with the hospitals because they are not ready to accept or to receive the cases like I remember in the end of December and 1st January 21, we were being transferring 350 COVID cases daily to the hospitals. I don't know if we can receive and accept. This is why the vaccine center, the vaccination, the chronic medicines, the awareness, the training, the PCR, all this kind of work need to be supported. And as Mrs. Maha mentioned, Dr. Maha mentioned, the challenge, even if we're working 3 years to 4 years or 5 years and more, we need to prepare the community not to count always in donors. We need to go back to the life, normal life. And this is something usually in Middle East, we want to solve the world in 24 hours. We cannot. We have to work for a long term. We thought the Syria crisis will be finished in 3 months, 11 years, and it's continue. So this is a big challenge, how we have to maintain and to sustain the program, to build our capacity to continue. Volunteering management, it's a big challenge. How we can maintain the volunteer who is giving 30 hours per week for free. This is a big challenge. The staff who are leaving, the people who are leaving the country, the people who are suffering cannot continue, the education and others. So the challenge is, according to the strategy, to complement the role of the others, to help only the advantage that as I mentioned, we are in all the country, and we have from all these community, and we can help each other to continue and not to compete and not to duplicate. This is the big challenge, sharing data, sharing information, sharing experience, lessons learned, and helping the community in saving lives and preserving dignity. Thank you.
Thank you. And if I can go out of order now a bit, but ask you next, Haneen, because I think some of that involves creating these systems that you talked about beforehand. And I wonder if you could talk a bit more about that. What kind of systems are you referring to when you say that donors need to be building systems in this moment?
Right. Thank you very much, Will. So, Lebanon came into this crisis, well, which crisis? But let's just say the financial economic one, with very weak social protection systems. I'll talk just about social protection for a moment. What this specifically means is that it didn't have a robust database which could be relied on by different actors, including, for example, the Lebanese Red Cross, who wanted to do cash transfer. That is a reliable one that could be used to identify and support people. Now, there was a small one that had been putting along for 10 years, including with our support, the National Poverty Targeting Program, but we weren't able to scale it up to get it. And that has to partly do with the fact that the government was not giving priority to social protection, social assistance before the crisis. Now, everybody wants to do this. Everybody wants to get into the game, all the donors and government agencies and that. So it's good in one sense, but of course, it means all the more that the systems have to be there. I mean, very concretely, you need a database that is based on every person in that database is identified with one number, a unique identifier, which he or she will then, actually it's household based, they get assistance and therefore, and they're logged in the system, they're identified with that. If there's other assistance that's to be provided to them, you can address the issue of duplication and the like. It sounds kind of simple or sounds minor, but it actually isn't. It can be transformational in terms of efficiency, effectiveness, better targeting, all kinds of things. And most countries have moved already in that direction, including in the region. You have Jordan, you have Egypt, who's already developed and uses a unique number for its social assistance years ago. Turkey, Iran. Iran has 28 databases, social databases, which are connected to its what they call the social registry, and therefore, things really move very efficiently, effectively. So you really need that. Now we are building this. That's a nice thing, actually, that is finally, but without its difficulties, as Maha said, because the deep state rears its head when you start talking about data and data access and where the databases sits in that. And of course, part of it is also not understanding how data works these days. I mean, the data can sit anywhere. It doesn't mean it has to be in Ministry of Social Affairs for it to ministry to have control of it or anything. I mean, there's so we're moving in that direction. And what has really helped, and this is coming back to this notion of try to build on what is working in the government. You all know last year the experience with registering for the COVID vaccine through the Impact platform, which was developed under the Central Inspection, which is a government entity. It's a supervision, if you will, entity responsible to supervise government agencies. And quasi-independent, and so they, for whatever it happened, that they developed this Impact platform where people could register for COVID. And while in the beginning there might have been some, birthing pains, but it worked very well, and it actually built a lot of credibility with the population, dashboards, public communication to people, and so on. So we built on that, and this is where the new registration platform for social assistance, inshallah, will be based. This has now been agreed with a decision from the Prime Minister, and using the unique number of every Lebanese citizen. So you start building what's called the National Social Registry, so that next time you have a crisis, which we know in Lebanon there will be another crisis soon, unfortunately, you can very quickly and rapidly help people in an efficient, effective, equitable way. So that's kind of there's other parts of such systems which are important, like monitoring. Independent monitoring must be a feature, a standard feature of these programs. You have independent monitors, whether it be from civil society or what have you, that and grievance, because these programs will always have grievances. People always say, why did I not get it, my neighbor got? So you have to address them, and there could be, so 1, 2, 3 different building blocks of systems for these programs to run properly. I think there is progress on this, and we hope within a couple of months, these systems will be in place. It will be around the same time of the actual launch of the ESSN and, inshallah, the ration card program for the population. I hope that explains, clarifies. Thank you.
Definitely. No, thank you. And Sally, if I can turn to you, I heard that you did a podcast recently for a podcast episode for the Lebanese Center for Policy Studies, and you were talking about some of the priorities as you see them in the IMF negotiations, as the Lebanese government is just beginning consultations in preparation for negotiations on this package. You mentioned before the particular vulnerabilities that different groups face. Can you tell us a bit about your priorities that you would like to see to ensure sort of equitable social protection out of those talks?
Thanks, Will. I think the biggest priority right now is that we need to respond to the current vulnerabilities that are present in the country, and we've covered quite extensively in this talk, while looking at more longer-term developmental priorities at the same time, and ensuring that we can really look at things from a social stability lens as well. So just to sort of refer back to this sort of the nexus approach of programming that I mentioned earlier, we have basic unmet needs, and we need to ensure that those are addressed. While we need to, build, take a systems level approach that Haneen just very clearly explained from a social protection perspective, where we can contribute to specific programming for social assistance while taking a more universal, longer-term approach to a comprehensive social protection system that is clearly necessary in Lebanon. But at the same time, there's more outside of the more immediate humanitarian needs for Lebanese communities, Syrian refugees, Palestinian refugees, to meet their basic needs. We can look at more longer-term programming, because it's only through longer-term contributions that we can really also play our part in contributing to a bottom-up systems level change as well, in terms of the governance shifts, and we're already seeing that at the community level. We see social solidarity initiatives that are really rising, and youth initiatives, social entrepreneurship, economic development programming from a local economic lens that are really important, while at the same time really engaging in intercommunal discussions and support to really challenge this narrative that is being raised and creating these tensions among communities as well. So we really have to look at it holistically from us as the NGO community. Here I'm talking about civil society, INGOs, local organizations as well, but also in engaging networks of other groups that to bring into this discussion and debates that are not always potentially represented, but also have a voice. And it's only by then that we can really really contribute to this more longer term approach and ensure that the necessary protections are in place for the next crisis.
Thank you so much. And I want to remind everyone in the audience, please do submit questions through that button on the website. I've seen a couple have come in, and I will certainly get to those in a minute. But first, if I can turn back to you, Dr. Maher, you mentioned the elections. The elections are supposed to be scheduled for either March or May. It's not completely clear. And you said that donors shouldn't try and get involved in any way. Can you talk a bit about sort of how you think donors should be thinking about the elections, what that means in terms of the pressure that donors can exert? Is there any hope to do anything before then, or is it just a waiting game now to see if they do take place, and then if they do, what the result is?
Thanks, Will. I think what donors can do to help is insist on free and fair elections. And it's not enough to hold elections. I think this is something we need to be very conscious of, but rather that they really are free and fair. And there are specific issues that civil society organizations and activists have been asking for that would support this, that would support the possibility of having elections that are transparent and that are free and that are fair. These include the implementation of an oversight board that's part of the existing law, and that because the oversight of the elections right now, for example, is undertaken by the Ministry of Interior. The election law looks at, has provided for the possibility of in creating an independent board that actually oversees the elections, and this would go a long way in preventing the gerrymandering of or the use and abuse of votes, let's put it this way, as has happened in the past. Another key issue is how to deal with the expatriate vote. There's been a drive to get expats to register. There was an expat marathon just over the weekend. I think the deadline is the 20th for all Lebanese out there. So there is a drive to get expats to register. So guaranteeing that their vote will go where it needs to go, and that again these will be free and fair. The implementation of mega voting centers. This will go a long way in encouraging people to vote where they are rather than having to go to their areas of origin, particularly at a time in a country where there's no viable public transport and people are really limiting their movements because they simply cannot afford the price of fuel. Hanin talked about teachers, for example, where the price of fuel for them to get to school is more than what they're making in terms of salaries. So this is incredibly important. And I'm not going to go into all the details, but there is the independence of the media, election spending. There's a lot that the donor community can do in terms of pushing on the kinds of reforms that need to be put in place to ensure that those that are challenging the current political leadership stand a chance, that they will not be intimidated, that the issue of election spending doesn't dominate, particularly, again, in a context where there's so much vulnerability, that Lebanon has a history of politicians basically buying votes. So to make sure that people are protected against these kinds of practices. So there's a lot that the donor community can do on the framework. What they should not in any way, shape or form do is get involved in who's running, why they're running, supporting specific candidates over others, etc. This is not the job of the international community. They can really support just that process. And just on this issue, there is a lot of movement happening. It still hasn't, I'm in Washington right now, and I keep getting asked, so who's the credible opposition? Well, there is an opposition emerging. There is no Gandhi here, that's about to emerge, or Gamal Abdel. You don't have a charismatic leader who's leading the charge. Politics have changed. The nature of political movement has changed. We're in the 21st century. But what we are seeing is grassroots leadership emerging in a number of places. There is an opportunity here for, let's keep expectations down. We're not looking at radical change, but there is an expectation that it's possible to have some breakthroughs within Parliament if the elections take place. And I think we need to really try and create as much space as possible for that to happen. If people are interested, I can talk a bit more about what we're seeing, but I think that's enough for now.
If I can just ask you a quick follow-up question, which is our first question from the audience. This is from Eddie Sam'an, who is a comms specialist with the World Bank. And he says, but I think asking this question in a personal capacity, do you expect that the upcoming elections will bring a new set of leaders that will be more willing to contain damages and start to bring about real change? Should we be hopeful?
I think we should be hopeful that, and this is what civil society, different groups within civil society are doing right now. They're trying to help the various political groups that have emerged out of the October 19th demonstrations, but some of whom actually have been active prior to that. This is an accumulation of political activism over the past decade, at least, if not much longer. So the idea is to try and put together a broad-based opposition that is in agreement over the key, over a political program. So you're not voting for X or Y because they happen to be of your sect or of your family, etc. But you're voting for people because there is a political and an economic reform program and a social agenda that is part of their platform. Now, will that bring about dramatic change? I think we should be hopeful that this could lead to some breakthrough in Parliament. But keep in mind, change takes time. We're talking about a system that's incredibly entrenched. We're talking about people who've been running the show, not only we're not talking about the post-war period, but many of them actually were the leaders of the civil war between 1975 and 1990. They simply moved from the street to government. So turning this around will take time, but for me, this is the only way forward, because the alternative either leave the country or it descends into violence. There isn't much more room to maneuver. So keep expectations, don't raise expectations, but I think there will be some breakthroughs. And if you have a coherent opposition, doesn't matter the size it is, but if you have a coherent opposition, you can already begin impacting decision-making within Parliament, which can also then translate to the executive and to the presidential branch.
Thank you. And our next question is from Carla Hamoud, who's with the Congressional Research Service. And Haneen, this one is for you. Carla asks if you could speak a bit more specifically about the obstacles to the implementation of both the ESSN cash transfer program and the ration card program. And I think you touched on some of those. But her other question, I think, is interesting, which is a question of currencies. What World Bank programs, if any, are currently dispersing aid in dollars? And has this generated any tension among aid recipients receiving aid in lira?
Thank you. I'll take the last question first, because that was one of the issues that spend a lot of time with government trying to negotiate, and one of the elements of delaying. So, indeed, the World Bank had always believed, given the multiple exchange rate in Lebanon and the fact that there is no macro framework and so on, and which basically is translated into its very high inflation and rapid deterioration, that really the best way to preserve the value for people of cash transfer is to pay them in dollars. Ultimately, of course, people should be paid in the national currency, but until that time, and until inflation is arrested and so on, our programs should disperse in dollars. It took a long time negotiating this with the government and central bank, but that has been achieved. And therefore, when we start with the ESSN, disbursement to the beneficiaries will be in US dollars. Again, until that time when there's a unified exchange rate and the like. Now other programs, we don't disperse cash per se. Really, we have an education program, but here we are helping with, we pay school fees, we help with curriculum reform. There is now, however, in the education sector, we are supporting incentives, top-ups for teachers to be able to, for them to come to schools and survive. This will be paid in Lebanese pounds, but at a close to market rate. But essentially, this is, and many humanitarians are coalescing around the same thing, paying either in foreign currency in dollars, or if in Lebanese, very close to the market rate. Obstacles to getting ESSN and equally important, the ration card program up and running. One, as I mentioned, and Maha also stressed it, is the agreement on what data and what database to use. So there was months and months of conversations about this with the previous government in particular. And finally, in one meeting, we basically said, okay, forget all these little databases you have here and there. Even among themselves, they couldn't agree as to which one to use. So we said, let's start afresh. Let us start a new registration and intake platform process database. And therefore that was, and it was accepted actually, because I think there was such disagreement internally between the different government agencies on which database they should be used that they all could not say no to this suggestion. And that's what launched the work on impact. So, but again, that took months and months, and I think that we've had other legislative issues with ESSN where a program was changed when it went into Parliament. This is again being now rectified, and essentially, the rest is procedural. Now, we have pretty tough conditions to be met because in this environment, you have to, in terms of audit and third-party monitoring and so on. And so we will not disperse money until they're met. And I think the Lebanese know that, obviously, the government, and they're seeking now to meet them. But we stuck to those where we cannot, especially with elections coming up. This is not going to be election money. This needs to go to the right people, those who deserve it, verified, and so on. So that's where we are. Thank you.
Thank you. And I apologize to those of you in the audience whose questions we haven't asked, but I do want to do one final quick fire round around our four speakers and ask each of you if you have a call to action, either for those in the audience who are watching today, or for the US government, for other donors. The focus of this talk is on how external actors can help. What would you like to see people do or not do, if that may be the case? If I can ask sort of 30 seconds each, if I could start with you, Mr. Katani.
Well, frankly, as Dr. Maha mentioned, the aim is to help through humanity. The people, they need a lot of support. And I think according to our plan as international and local NGOs, there's a need to support through these plans. We don't want to have something where it's not accepted or it's not cannot be delivered or helped and supported. So the main is to focus on the health sector, the cancer needs, the cancer medicines needs, the chronic medicines, support of the health sectors, and also with all the needs of the support of the health sectors, and also the socio-economic, the cash transfer programs and others, the insurance, the cash in health, the cash in social. It's something where it's very important to see how we can help in this period. As they mentioned, especially Dr. Mahdi said, temporary time, 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, it depends according to the needs. Then we have to move forward and to think together, because usually the problem in Middle East, especially, that we are working as one man show, not as a teamwork. So we need to work as a teamwork and to take lessons learned and to follow up, not to repeat the same problem and the same gaps and others. And we like to maintain always the accountability and transparency as the Lebanese Red Cross in a way that we will maintain this service in helping the people according to the needs and according to the priority. Chronic medicines accepted, all the needs in the country and the health sectors and in socio-economic situation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Next, Sally, if I can ask you the same question.
Thanks, Will. I'll try not to repeat what Mr. Katani has said, but I mean, I think the figures, the data on poverty and vulnerability across communities and the tensions rising is very worrisome. So my message is just imagine if the current responses were not even there, if the Lebanon crisis response plan didn't exist, or the pledges currently made at the emergency response plan in Paris to Lebanon aren't made, and the blast response and the COVID response. So imagine what conversation we would be having on Lebanon and this and the situation in Lebanon if these didn't exist. So therefore my message is we do have frameworks, we do have plans, there are mechanisms in place, and we have a responsibility to continue to support while ensuring that accountability and transparency is put at the heart of all of these responses for us to continue to serve the communities that are most vulnerable in the country.
Thank you so much. Haneen?
I'll be very quick, Will, because I pretty much agree with what Sally's message. International community should continue to provide humanitarian support to the Lebanese in the different ways that exist, but not lose sight of the pressure on reform. That's absolutely must. Just keep on with the pressure on the governments and the political class and the institutions to undertake reforms. Thank you.
Thank you. And last but not least, Dr. Maha.
I agree with what Sally, George, and Haneen obviously have said. Maybe I will add one thing, which is also as humanitarian support is being provided, but that this support is also complemented with some strategies to get some development activities going, including, for example, support for small and medium businesses that are failing and should not be failing because they're otherwise successful, and it's the economic crisis that's pushing them to the ground. There's a lot of work that can be done in that area that would help also people basically continue standing on their feet without having to be totally reliant on aid. I think that's incredibly important, so kind of complementing the humanitarian support that's incredibly urgent with other development-related projects that support people, that help people stand up. So stop there.
Thank you so much. So I think we've heard today the really dire humanitarian conditions in the country, and unfortunately they seem to be worsening by the day. But I think a sense among our speakers today that we need to ensure that aid continues to get to those who need it most, and that we really mustn't have any conditionality in terms of humanitarian aid, while really keeping a focus on conditionality for larger scale reforms to unlock more significant aid. And I think there are some opportunities in these crises to be building data sets so that we can better target those in need, to be building some of the systems that will serve Lebanon in the longer term. So I think there are some nuggets of optimism that you have provided us with. So thank you so much to our 4 speakers for this really, I think, enlightening discussion. Thank you to those of you who watched at home. And if you are interested in following this topic further at CSIS, we're going to be releasing a policy brief on this matter before the end of the year. And I would encourage you to follow more of the work that our speakers are doing. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.